your work a while ago, and it seems interesting.
Oh.
I haven't
Oh, that's
looked
nice.
yet. Yeah.
Okay, and what do you do, or what do you study?
I studied animation. I studied animation.
Oh, right.
And I'm thinking about interactive media and stuff, and I was interested in the goldsmiths course.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Hello. All right. I just kind of asking people roughly, you know, what they do and where they're from, just so I've got an idea of, you know.
I'm doing a master's at the university in poetic practice.
In?
Poetic practice, so it's kind of visual arts and some theory stuff.
Oh, right.
Creative writing type thing as well. So
Okay.
yeah.
Great. Yeah.
I'm a postdoc at Stockholm University, and goldsmith and the school Southend-on-sea.
Oh, right.
And
With which department?
media and communications.
Oh,
So,
okay. I should have spotted you.
so I was, that was my first visit. My colleagues have been there since this person here for James.
Oh, right.
So I'm just getting started.
Right.
So I was curious to check out just to watch
Oh, right. Okay.
And
Thank
I'm doing research on interfacing glitch art, digital cultures online.
Then you need Olga. So, can I hear from your friend?
Oh, yeah. I'm from Kingston University. I'm
Oh.
working on philosophy of violence, actually.
Nice.
So I'm here because of him, actually.
Yeah.
He's been talking about you for 2 years now, so...
Oh, right.
Hyped you up, you know.
Exactly.
Is it? Did he tell you what I think of the Navy that he goes on about? All 6 of them.
What do you mean?
You know what I mean.
I don't know, I was worried. You know?
And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Why you've got such a little Navy in your country.
Okay, it's one boat. It's broken down now.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's broken down.
Yeah, it's been now. There's some.
We're expecting parts from Germany.
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah. So that one boat we have is. at
It's
the
not-
moment
not-
just
not-
parked in Sicily.
Not
so.
working.
Yes.
Oh, you're from there as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Ah.
Slovenia also.
Ah, yeah. Sorry, this is just Slovenian stories. They have a very tiny bit of ocean.
But it is an ocean. I mean, it's a tiny bit, but it's there.
Yeah, it's like a parking lot.
All right, fair enough.
Better move on.
I'm from London and I'm researching geometric shapes in literature and art.
What does that mean?
Well, it certainly takes hard to say, to be honest. I normally teach contemporary fiction, so this is a new project, but what you're doing sounds so interesting.
Ah.
And that's why I'm here.
Thank you.
So I actually come from a neuroscience background.
You come from a...
neuroscience
Oh,
background.
great.
I work in science policy now, and
Right.
I'm working on a project about citizen science. And I'm not sure what I've got myself in for really with this talk, but I read the description and I thought it sounded interesting, so I came.
Okay. And are you associated with any university or anything?
UCL.
UCL. Right.
Hi.
Do you want to say, even though I'm sure everyone knows you? Or?
I don't think so.
Go ahead.
I can say, yeah, so I'm in the Mediashed department in Norway. And I'm still researching the relationship between art and political action.
Yeah.
So this is what I am here. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a student at LCC and I study art direction, and I'm interested in networked communications and impacts on mental health.
Right. Audrey, do you want to just... we're just trying to work out where everyone's from, and everyone's from everywhere, but do you want to just a...
Artist based in London, and I work with materiality of structures
And you have an affiliation to where?
Oh, you mean?
Job.
Oh, British.
because lots of people kind of are students or whatever, just so people know. Oh, you're going out there? We're just introducing. Do you want to just introduce a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
And why you've got the case?
Of this?
Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Jason. I work with light and lasers and things. That's actually also the case. Yeah, I make light installations, but I'm also very much interested in computational aesthetics, and I'm a programmer as well, and yeah, all this kind of stuff. I studied at Goldsmiths.
Great, thank you, Jason.
I'm a history of art student, and I just came along to sort of broaden my horizons.
Oh, right.
Right.
Okay. All right. Are you with you're at Goldsmiths? All right, mate. We're just kind of saying roughly, where we're from. No.
Everyone is saying.
Yeah. Well, you're the last one.
Oh.
We were waiting for you.
I'm maybe in the wrong room.
No.
Hey, I'm Joel. I'm Canadian. I'm an artist. I started a PhD here, practice-based PhD in October. I do art and science, kind of collaboration stuff.
Okay.
At University of Westminster.
Okay. Are you doing an introduction, or are we just going to go for it? Oh, okay.
Alright, so we're starting. My name is Olga Williamova. I work in media arts in Royal Holloway. And it's my pleasure to host Graham Harwood, who is with Matsuko Yokokoji, a member of an art group, YoHa. So Graham and Matsuko have formed a number of groups over years, and they've been active since the beginning of the 90s. Between 1996 and 2007, they had a group called Mongrel, together with Richard, sitting here. And Mongrel became very well known and produced very high profile projects, such as Natural Selection in 1996 and National Heritage in 1997. And National Heritage was the first online commissioned by Tate Modern. The most recent projects by Harwood and
Yokokoji.
I'm not pronouncing her name right, sorry, Yokokoji. Is Database Addiction, and it was produced between 2015 and 2017. Correct of the Intertidal Zone, 2013-2016. Plastic Raft of La Medusa, 2016-2017. Endless War, Invisible Airs, Coal-Fired Computers, and Tantalum Memorial. So these are from going backwards.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm very interested in what you have to say. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay. So, I think there's a couple of things I want to do. The first thing is that, I'm really happy if we talk to each other all the time, rather than, some kind of set piece and then, then questions at the end. Because, if I say something that people don't get, because I don't know the backgrounds of everyone, then it's better to have that conversation as we're kind of moving along. So I think that's really important. And then I'm going to do a couple of things. I want to talk kind of briefly about the first part of database addiction, which will give you some idea of maybe how YoHa would think about a live project. And then what I want to do is I want to talk about kind of personalisation, and I want to kind of think about possible methods with which you might interrogate such a subject. By personalisation, I mean, if you think Cambridge Analytica and the kind of techniques behind it, okay, in kind of very short notion. But it's also what happens every time you go for an interview or, many other situations. So I want to talk about possible strategies or methods for interrogating that. And then I think underlying both these kind of areas is the notion of kind of critical technical practice, which sounds really awful. and some days it is. There's no doubt about it after you've installed something for several days. But basically, I'm not going to kind of go into it too much unless people want me to. What I want you to do is kind of between the first project and the second project, you should be able to kind of ascertain what a kind of critical technical practice. Hello, Stephen Fortune. It's a lovely jumper. So we should be able to ascertain from what I'm talking about. It's good that Stephen's here because he worked on database addiction, so that's very good. Yeah, so I want to kind of like have a general conversation, but what I really want you to get out of it is the kind of possible methodologies with which you can examine different subjects within a kind of technical, critical context, really. So these wonderful forms here. This is all the business plans for the National Drug Treatment Monitoring System, which is a part of the project that I want to talk about to give people some idea of possible kind of methods with which we might approach something like addiction and databases, how we might bring them together and then figure them and why we might figure them. I'll show you some slides, I think. So this is Matsuko and me, looking slightly pretentious, but we were in Bristol with Stephen, and but Matsuko's not very well. She's got a kind of rare condition, only 5 people in Europe with it, which is why she's not here today. So database addiction took place in Lauren Hewitt House, which is situated in the heart of Brixton. And what we was interested in was like, how familiar are people with the phrase like, you know, more than human? That's the nice way of putting a kind of anti-humanist argument. So when you walk in the door of the addiction centre, first of all, you go in the toilet and it extracts your urine and your blood. You know, that's what you do in the centre. And then as you go through, it's extracting all your information. So like kind of bodily functions and the database itself are kind of intermeshed. So if we're thinking about more than human, we're thinking about the kind of sociality, the politics, the notion of governance within that kind of structure. Also, the structure in brief, what it does is it kind of changes the architecture of the building, which we'll think about in a little bit more detail. So, being an addict is frustratingly hard work. Finding substances, food, shelter, care, treatment are complicated formulations that require knowledge situated in the actions and reactions of being addicted. Yet this knowledge never enters into the machinery of governance that purportedly cares for drug users in the UK. This situated knowledge has much to tell us about the forms of reticulated discipline that governs addicts and workers in the care system. And I think it's really important. I mean, when I was working with Richard and Mongrel, we were able to say, like, go and work with a group of people, and we didn't much care for the kind of surrounding governance or management systems around it, and we'd positively be hostile to those. But I think because of how different kinds of enterprise have adopted database structures, that's become increasingly impossible, because it's very difficult. You can't actually work with a group of people like addicts unless you're working with the management of addicts, because there is no longer any kind of separation. And I think that was kind of key in what we was trying to do. So in 2015, YoHa took an ecological and aesthetic approach to working with the UK's National Health Service addiction clinics to investigate how databases produce an abstraction of clinical modalities. Database addiction explored the methods by which the materiality of the care centre's work can be managed and governed at multiple scales from within computation, and how such processes transform work-based cultures and the lives of addicts. So I mean, simply put, like you go in and you say, like, how much time do you know, to care workers or social workers, how much time are you spending on the database, and how much did you spend on the database before it was brought in here? And they would say something like, well, I used to spend 40 minutes with a client and 20 minutes writing up notes. Now I spend 40 minutes with the machine, you know, and 10 minutes with the client. And then I go through all my kind of emergency traffic lighting on everything else. So there's a kind of sea change in what people, or how people see their time spent, and how they see themselves integrated or not within these machines. So we had kind of several kind of objectives at the start of the project, and we wanted to explore how databases mediate relationships within healthcare. A good example of this is a few years ago we worked with midwives in Liverpool NHS and also in the Netherlands, and they told a story, and I think it kind of makes it very, very, very clear, this idea of kind of more than human, or how it works. And the midwives would said to us, how many of you have had kids? Anyway, okay, so what they told us was that there was this this thing in the database which was hip dysplasia, and that basically if the shoulder got caught in the pelvis, then it could be a mild case where they just give the baby a little push one way and the baby comes out, or it could be quite severe and they have to get the forceps out and full on. But in the database there was only one entry, and it was like you either had it or you didn't have it. And if you had it and they ticked it, every birth after that would be a cesarean section. And that was how it went. So basically the midwife was making a judgment. She was going to tick a box or not tick a box, and then that would mean that all births after that would be a cesarean section. And so that was a kind of like a very clear example. And what they also told us was that the hospital got more money for cesarean sections. Cesarean section is the hospital gets better paid for one of those than it does for a more natural birth. And so they, what the midwives did was, with the same database that was able to cut into bodies, what they were able to do was monitor how many cesarean sections the hospital did against natural births, and then protest for more natural births. So I'm not trying to say, that the database is working within one particular authoritarian power structure, because it's relational. Of course, the power is flowing in all different directions at the same time, if you can kind of reveal the structures that are underlying it, if you can interrogate the relations within the database structure, if you can get you'll probably work or something. How many people here have experienced role-based permission structures at work? Yes, me. It's basically that your job title dictates which level of access or which view you have a database. And if you don't have the right access, the right view, then you don't see things. So if you want to interrogate a kind of company or an organisation or a database, it's better not to look at the information, but to look at things like, what's the table structure? How did they formulate? How did they discipline the subject they were looking at? And the role-based permission structures will immediately tell you who's in charge of which section. And also, the great thing is, of course, because it's not private, it's not kind of secret data, so they will give it to you. And so you can find out an awful lot about the governance of an enterprise from such structures. Anyway, I hope that's a clear example. Any questions about that? Medical databases, I love them. So Database Addiction was a collaboration by YoHa, and we worked with Dr. Luke Mitchison, Jean Demars, Samantha Penn, and Stephen Fortune. And then we did a kind of neat trick that is probably worth telling you about. We did something which is called a critical friends group. And I don't know whether any of you, how you've done your research before, but when you do research, what you end up doing is you have to kind of validate it afterwards. You have to say who attended, who did what your outputs are. If you have a thing called a critical friends group, that is a group of people that help you with any problems coming up, then you don't have to assess your research because it's done at the same time you're doing it, and you can avoid a whole bunch of bullshit. So, just a footnote for you. Okay, so a first inquiry took place then in Brixton, in Lauren Hewitt House. And it's staffed by a busy and engaged team of dedicated drug workers, clinical psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, administrators, and reception staff with a heavy workload. The clinic is itself a collapsed set of services, administrative machines and architectures awkwardly housed together through cuts in funding and policy changes. Along with such cuts comes the conflation of machinery, furniture and forms of administration. Many people have to repeat the same information in different systems and have no protocol to share resources. So, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to take a kind of ecological view of how these databases are acting. So they're acting on architecture like people meet on the stairs, not in the office, because they're away from their machines. One room is a secure room because that can look at children in danger, but other people can't go into that space. So the very architecture of the building, the design of the toilets, that you're surveyed by a camera in the toilets, all these things, all these kind of collections of your body or movement around the building is part of, you know, the database structure. So the enterprise, the architecture, the social space, the flows of the space are all part of this thing that we can call more than human. Make sense? Okay. I mean, you can safely say that all the work at the Addiction Support Centre is interrelated to collections of information that in turn evidence decisions and activities and result in quantifiable structures that reciprocally create other kinds of individual actions. Okay, so, yeah.
Could you maybe say just if it's private or public, like does this fall under this center, these databases? Is the whole thing?
Yeah, that's one of the problems that the project addressed, I think, is that it's not very clear. I don't think it's clear for the people that work there. We tried to track the data and Stephen worked on that. And in the end, they thought we were trying to hack the system and stopped us. I'll show some graphs about how far Stephen got with it. But we tried to look at that. I mean, basically, this is medical data, so it should be completely private. And us working there meant that every time there was a record of someone, we turned the other way. So we made absolutely sure we wasn't going to look at any data of anyone. And that was the best way to have us to have access to the structures rather than the content. And in this incident, we were only, this is the first part, we were only working with the administrative staff and with the systems. We weren't working with the kind of client groups in this. So there's kind of there's many kind of key formations that produce the kind of keystones of the project. But I think one of them, especially for this, that was useful was we were using at the time a notion of art as inquiry, which can be thought of as a method that makes the space between theory and practice ambiguous. And we can loosely think of this as an aesthetics of engagement with practice, or to put it another way, the multiple scales of making or engaging with the process of art type projects. So instead of like thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to make this for this project, It's basically what everyone that's engaged within the project space gets out of it. So we're not aiming to produce a representation. Sorry, it's just me and Audrey have been having conversations about representation. In database addiction, asking people questions, changing the space, being present, paying attention, all affect changes on different scales. You can imagine this as a yearning for an aesthetics that fall outside of their current ability to represent them. And I mean, we know this, that like you go in the addiction centre and everyone's pissed off having to use the database. No one likes it. Everyone thinks it's kind of a mess. The management think that it doesn't do what they want. No one likes it. You know, there's just complete resistance. But because it's described as this technical solution to some kind of management system, then people are not able to articulate that. Because they say, well, I just don't understand it. And even though they're pissed off with it. And, you know, I would talk to them about, you know, with some kind of Foucaultian ideas, which they understood exactly in the context they were working. They understood how you know, knowledge was being sorted into different flows of power and how that was affecting people's lives. But it was very difficult for people to articulate a resistance to these kinds of machines. And we proposed to them things like, okay, so everyone hates this system. Why don't we have a month where you only fill in the bits of the database you want and all the other bits just fall off the screen? And then we can see what happens at the end of the month. But the local health trust were not willing to engage in such a ill-disciplined activity, even though it was a good suggestion. It made people laugh. So within this idea of arts inquiry, the artists make things, propositions, and attempting to explain the phenomena caught in the gaze of the project. And gaze here, you can really think within a kind of, because the way Foucault uses gaze within the clinic, you can adopt that same kind of gaze and you can say, okay, so a relational machine, before it's filled up with anything, also possesses a gaze. So the database has a gaze. And you can consider how you know, like cut up a subject, how you discipline it, you know, how you break it down, you consider that a gaze as well. I mean, if you've got a gaze, you've also got things that are not in the gaze. So we can think about things like, we'll come back to that. Okay, so it's a gaze, but it's not a reduction of phenomena to literature or a system of logics, but instead this can be thought of as a knowledge incorporated into a thing that the artist creates, points to, through revealing the gaze. And this is not the gaze of an audience of art, but can be thought of as being nearer to the gaze of a clinician trying to formulate a diagnosis. I imagine people are fairly familiar with Foucault's notion, or you've all been to the doctor. And hopefully... It's one and the same thing. Well, the gaze is where the doctor... most doctors are a bit shit, aren't they? But if you get a really good one, like Matsuko's got this really bad illness, and the way the doctors look at her, and they don't really know what's going on because it's kind of a complicated illness. So you get 2 or 3 look at her in different ways, and you can see that it is a silent gaze that they're doing. They're trying their best to intuit on top of all the knowledge they've already got. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. And it's quite interesting to relate that kind of gaze to how a database is structured. That, like, what you do is you have your subject, you break the subject down into the smallest parts, you make it into entities and relations, and then you fill it up with information, and then you compare it from different points of view, different perspectives through the data set. And so you can see the database as having this gaze. Make sense? You don't get convinced.
Do you think that then has energy shown?
Hmm?
Do you think it has a certain form of technical intuition, or it can be formulated?
I think it has a technical intuition before it even begins. Yeah, I think there's it was the model of databases is the ANSI model from the mid 1970s, and within that very formulation, it was already it was pregnant with a particular gaze, just waiting to to be applied, to become part of whatever it was thinking about. And of course, when it becomes part of whatever it's thinking about, it then becomes instrumental in changing it, which we'll come to a bit later. So I think that that's one kind of idea that we can think about within this project. I've got the gaze with this lady who's got the keys. I think a second kind of method that we can think about is that using and programming computers implies the interrelation of different forms of logic. And this was developed, this notion, I think me and Matthew borrowed when we were writing about abstract urbanism. So using and programming computers implies the interrelation of different forms of logic, both at the level of programming the machine in order to perform calculations and at that of regulating the conduct of users in manipulating mice and menu systems in order to produce desired results. So you're thinking about kind of the logic with which, as coders we might program a machine. Hello. And but at the same time, when someone's just using a mouse, they're being programmed at the same time. Yeah. So it's those kinds of logics. And one way to think about how the mass adoption of these forms of logic affects the clinic is in the mode of what Foucault would call as discipline, as it entails analysing and breaking down a phenomena through modelling it to produce a kind of remote control. And there's a kind of very simple way of thinking about this. Like I'm sure everyone here writes shopping lists. So when you write a shopping list, of course, that's a form of remote control over your shopping. It also disciplines the thing that you're trying to do. So as soon as you write a list about something, you're disciplining it. You're taking it apart so that you can have some kind of remote control over it. Or if you see like a recipe, what it does is it breaks the meal down into a number of constituent parts and a series of instructions that will reconstruct it. So that kind of machine, or the list as a machine, list architecture, just writing lists, is a very familiar machine, and the database is that kind of machine, but on kind of like multiple perspectives, if you like, or multi-dimensional list making, with some strict rules. So computation disciplines the way a phenomena is approached and analysed. So when it becomes visible again from within the computer, it makes the phenomena materially available for comparison and modification. As users participate in the flows of power created by comparing information, they become normalised to its process and entangled in the interrelation of logics at different scales. So when you go to the supermarket, you're interfacing the database. The supermarket is the database. There is no distinction between the two. Yeah? People don't look that convinced. Never mind. So, let me find. Okay. So the logics represented on this table interrelate through disciplining the organisation and forcing compliance with various databases through such mechanisms as treatment outcome profiles, which is TOPS, which was Stephen's favourite. TOPS is the main method of being able to calculate modalities. So in the clinic, what happens is that if someone doesn't come back for 6 months, then the clinic gets paid. But if someone comes back within 6 months, they don't get paid. Okay, so it's good if someone comes and then dies, because then you can get paid. Okay, but you can't get paid if what you're doing is looking after some drunks up the street who don't attend the clinic. Okay, so the TOPS is the main method. It's like, you must have all heard of, like, you know, patient journeys. So the idea of TOPS is to take the modalities out of that journey, and from that you can calculate, how well someone's doing and monetize, what they're up to. And we'll come back to that, because that's part of the story of personalisation as well later. So what it's meant to do is measure change and progress in key areas of the lives of people being treated in drug and alcohol services. And this form of compliance affects overall funding, policy, staff efficiency and job security. So like when we was there and we was asking, like, okay, so you've got to go in this room with this person who's maybe a bit off their head on drugs. Do you have like some kind of warning system? How would you tell another social worker that this person might be a problem? Of course, most people aren't, but some people are. How do you warn them? They said, oh, we have a traffic light system. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, if you don't fill out the forms correctly, then the traffic light goes red. So they didn't have anything for doing that. What they had was, they had traffic light systems for being compliant in your form filling, which I was really impressed with. So basically people just write notes, kind of to each other to tell them. So data collection occurs like at the end of each month. So there's lots of different databases that we're talking about. There's the National Drug Treatment Monitoring System, but then there's also like the local health trust system, and then there'll be like housing systems, and all of these will be kind of locked together in some kind of not very interesting way, and we can have a look at that flow in a minute, and we'll go back to it. Okay. Okay, so the project itself close read the structure of this National Drug Treatment Monitoring Service. So we kind of like read through, when you first came in, there was a series of business plans on, so we kind of read through those and tried to understand those and how they were used for kind of monitorising the system. And what we tried to do, or where we got to, was that we saw the database unlocking, we saw how the database could unlock and articulate addiction from an ideological, technical, political and bureaucratic or governmental viewpoint. And we kind of asked the questions about like why there was so much data on addicts. And Luke, who was kind of in charge, said to us, well, the thing is that it's much cheaper to keep monitoring someone than it is for them to go through the criminal justice system. So he said that it's really difficult for a politician to spend money on addicts because they're the undeserving sick. So therefore it's much better, to have a monitoring system. Doesn't mean you're going to treat them, because treatment's quite expensive, but to monitor them is actually quite a cheap and effective way to show you're doing something. So that was kind of like one of his rationales for why there was so much there, so much data. So keeping the addicted on a perpetual treadmill of monitoring with substitute opiates is far cheaper than dealing with the outfall of criminal activity needed to maintain a habit on the street. We can begin to see this database the formation of this database as pointers to a fluid formation of power that is not only a strategy in action for government, but holds itself open to an emergent ambiguous diagram, a sketch of relations and a technical machine for reticulate discipline. A theatre for the performance of power within a capability to insight, provoke, to compare and combine what ideology can articulate about addiction, and at the same time is coexistent with creating new knowledge. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but instead of, with this database, unlike many of the others that I'd looked at in the NHS, in the NHS, most of the others were kind of like someone went out and they asked for private companies to make a database. But in this one, there were a number of fairly ambiguous business plans, and then there were 8 separate companies that you could go to have your... Is that right, Stephen? I think so.
Not sure about 8, but the general.
Yeah. So then you get these companies competing to produce the database and to produce different systems. But the systems are never complete. So the whole idea is to have a generalised monitoring system that's looking for its own self-perfection. It's the idea of having a machine of total control, which has been the dream throughout, the 20th century, administrative total control. So it kind of acts like a kind of an R&D, a kind of research and development for what would be ideal if you was monitoring. A kind of utopia of addiction monitoring is the where this particular database is trying to go. Good.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
You're coming to. How did you produce this?
I'm going to come to that.
Yeah.
So what we did. I'll tell you what we actually did now. So we spent about 2 or 3 months talking to all the people in the addiction centre, all the main workers, and we found out things like they would say to us, well, I work with the drunks down the road, so I can't put in the database, but my manager says I'm doing something else. So the database lies. Most people were cheating the database, but then they couldn't say they were cheating the database and they said something else. So it kind of painted one picture of this machine, but then there's all these humans going, well, I just won't put it in. I'll get someone to do it for me. So there was a lot of cheats, and there was a lot of things that were left invisible within the machinery. And so that's so we worked with people, and they told us all these different stories. They asked questions of where, all they kept asking was, where does the data go all the time? They had a contract which meant that they had to sign people up for the database individually. They had to sign whoever they were talking to, but they didn't know where the data went. So they were instructed to sign them up, but they didn't know. We found out that some of it went out to research, but we couldn't actually find out, how many research projects were involved in it. That's right, isn't it? We never found that out. So this is Stephen's diagram.
Matsuko takes credit for the design.
Oh. So we spent all the time talking to people in the clinic and sitting on the stairs, talking to people in their offices, and we were trying to think of okay, so how can we make something happen in this space, change something in this space that would allow people to kind of figure these relations that they clearly understand. And that's why when we came to the table, the table is in their main conference room. So in this room they do art, but every meeting about any client or anything else takes place around this table. And so the table was just a normal office table, and we decided that what would be a really useful thing to do would collect all the comments from people, use Stephen's diagram of the system where the data goes, look at the tops. These are all the comments from people here. And then round the outside, what we did was we decided that we would we would look for the probability with which words are used. So we were doing natural language processing. So if we go to one of those, let's go to one of those. So this one's risk. And you can see here that, so we start off with the word risk, and then we look for which word is associated with that word the most within a kind of like, okay, so when you do this, you take a word, you look for every word after it, every word after that, and like the same before if you're using a kind of 3-word window, and then you look for the probabilities with which they occur, and you look at the probabilities with which they occur within all the documents, and so you're able to make a kind of discourse analysis. Not going to make much sense to us, but it makes sense to them because it was for them. It's not for like another audience. This is for people that read this stuff all the time. So they were able, so here it goes, risk, eviction within governance includes local attributes, codes, treatment, exit, and then governance is associated with clinical treatment framework. So what this does is kind of map out how the discourse is used in particular kinds of words in particular kinds of contexts. And you can see in the table, let's go to the table, that what Matsuko did, this is kind of quite small letters around the edge, and the idea was that if he was bored in a meeting, you could sit there with your cup of tea and then you'd kind of drift off looking at how words are being used within the discourse and not being used within the discourse. So all of this was a kind of like a kind of abstraction to allow people to see how power was flowing through. And then because this was a kind of major problem for them, this TOPS thing, because it was the main system of monitoring them, there's a section here, and in the data flow here, which is pretty unreadable on this slide, sorry about that. The table's really big. I should have brought the slides with you. But this was the first time that people would have been able to map where their work was actually going within this whole structure, which was really good work by Stephen. Okay.
How did you choose the seed words?
They chose them. The staff chose them. They decided which seed words, and then it went to Luke, who we were collaborating.
Like, what was the basis of that choice? Did you give them some, like you asked them to choose?
I just asked them to choose, and then they went to Luke, and he said, I think these ones are the best ones. They had a kind of like debate because this room's used by clients of the service as well, so they were a bit cautious about what went on it. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of, that's why you get kind of risk or whatever. So there was a bit of caution in how that would be done. Okay, any questions about that?
Can I just ask a really potentially daft question?
Sure.
In terms of taking the seed words and then finding the word that might follow or come before,
Yeah,
and then evolving,
co-locations, yeah.
I mean, how literally was that done?
It's done, so you get like, so if you have the words, so you have a word, you have the word after it and the word after that, and the word before it and the word before that. And what you do is you say, okay, how often does this word occur in relation to these other 4 words? And then once you've got that, and you do that for every single word in every single document, then you have the probability with which one word will appear. Because an alphabet, our alphabet is full of probabilities in how it's going to be used in a particular piece of text. So we can use those mathematical properties in order to work out a discourse analysis. So it doesn't tell you, you wouldn't want to rely on it. You still have to interpret it. It would only tell you that this word has been used, this often next to another word. But how you interpret that is something else. It just shows you relations. It's very easy, like in George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech. He only uses the word axis once. Yeah, that's the thing. So in this kind of model, it wouldn't show up very much. You'd have to look at all the discourse around it in order to find out that word had meaning.
Great, thanks. And was there choice in the way that you displayed it in terms of like how much did your selection of those words influence the order, or is this just
No, this is the order that the machine produced it in.
so like eviction is the top word that coincides
To
the top
risk.
associated
Yeah.
with the risk?
Yeah. So, like for the workers there, they would understand, the relationship between risk and eviction. I mean, which we can kind of imagine, but for them, it would be much clearer to them, and they would understand, yeah.
May I ask, in terms of your interpretation of this vocabulary pattern, did you have a discussion as well with the staff about, were there any surprises in terms of how
Yeah,
the
they
fell
couldn't
out?
understand how Wales got in there because this was for Public Health England, and
But just in terms of as well, both in terms of if they were perfectly, predictable workforce being having a very high count, but as well if there was some absence or some,
yeah, that was.
deviations from vocabulary that would,
Yeah, that's why they couldn't understand why there was because they were only dealing with England, when they saw all this kind of Welsh names and this, it's because of that study that was done, that's why it's got the Wales in it. So it was a way of them, to kind of navigate, how this discourse has emerged.
So that became sort of clarified as well.
Yeah,
in
I mean,
discussion with the institution itself as well, with the staff.
Yeah, I mean, we became interested in, when we did Endless War, we were interested in the way that soldiers would speak and write in the way that the database would be formulated. And in this context, we were interested in how often people would speak the same language that was in all the business plans. So how little difference is there between the entities and relations of the machine and how that thinks and how the person is speaking or acting. So again, it's back to this kind of more than human is what we were interested in that context.
Now you internalize that structure as well. I mean, in your own actual communication as well.
Yeah, I mean, all we're doing there for people is we're trying to figure this. We're trying to put it, you know what I mean, make the table, figure it in some way so that everyone that comes in can have those kinds of conversations.
What was the most common word and what was your favourite word?
I didn't have one.
You didn't have one? That's unusual.
Hello. Okay. So hopefully, that will have given you just a kind of broad idea about how a particular project might be approached. Now, I get to find my glasses case. Any other questions are good, but I need to reboot. So what I want to do now is I want to kind of talk through a project that I'm no longer doing for many reasons. But I'm going to talk through some of the research that we was doing on personalisation, really as a way to think about how we might approach a subject like that, as opposed to this one, which is in a very kind of clear context. It was for that, this is not, it's not an art piece that then goes on and gets put in an art gallery. This is a piece that was for those people in that building and for the kinds of conversations they were having. I mean, the table did move, and it was in other places. It was in various meetings for clinical psychologists so that they could discuss the kinds of databases they didn't want. But it's very much a kind of product of that space and thinking with those people. It's not, we never really wanted to dislocate it, even though it probably will be this year anyway. So, I don't need this thing to load.
Graham, it seemed like when you were discussing this particular work, there was something about sort of the digital actualization of care, maybe, and that being posed against something like human intuition. Because, I mean, at the beginning you said people used to have like 40 minutes FaceTime,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
20 minutes, and then
Yeah.
now it's like 40
Yeah, I
minutes.
mean, one of the big things in the second part that we did, which was working with service users, so the people that went to the clinic, the big thing that they were all requesting really was good attention.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the biggest thing they wanted, was like someone who could listen so they could think better about their lives, really. And it was the very thing that the staff wanted to give in the first stage. What they wanted was to give people good attention, help people think through their lives, you know, and that didn't, because when they filled in the database, most of the data they never saw again, and it wasn't useful to them in their practice. They did have, however, the really useful thing that they all liked, they took notes. And what I couldn't understand was, like, in the note-taking that they took, you could have easily built a machine that would have extracted things to put in the database for management and just had a much more disciplined method of note-taking, which would have reduced the time enormously. You know, and that was one of the kind of suggestions that came out, really, was like, how could you do this differently, or, you know, other possible models. Yeah.
The table itself being a piece of furniture that's part of the architecture of the database structure, would you still figure that the table was some kind of, you know, critical space within that problematic infrastructure, or part of it? I mean, it's like if it's no position outside of the system in a way, we're all absorbed and immersed in it. So then would that room with that particular table be, you know, you're still operating within the system but trying to create a critical space?
Well,
or would you say that the table itself was somehow outside the database that you were studying?
No, I think it's completely within it. I think it's just drawing different kinds of relations together. And also it's, you know, for YoHa entering this space, you feel tangibly that people are trying to articulate something, but they can't articulate it. And we see kind of our role is to kind of imagine how can that be figured in this particular set of relations, and that's really our interest in that space. Okay, so anyone familiar with Kali Linux? Oh, Stephen is, he likes it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about personalization, and then then give people a quick idea of what Kali Linux is about, and how people might use it to kind of interrogate a subject. As I do that, I want to kind of begin to kind of give you a slight couple of nods towards kind of critical technical practice. And in order to do that, I just need to kind of say a couple of things about Phil Algree. So Phil Algree's 1997 essay towards a critical technical practice, Lessons Learned in Trying to Reform AI, offers a few noteworthy methods that correspond to YoHa's work. Algree states that computers are not simply instrumental. The computer helps structure the site of practice as part of its very design. He constructs a sense in which computing can be seen as a form of imperialism, as it aims to reinvent virtually every other site of practice in its own image. Are people okay with that idea? So like every time, you know, like we end up with like Photoshop reconstructing photography. We end up with Word reconstructing writing. Yeah, so that kind of thing, really. Algree explores how his thinking was altered by both his learning computer science and his subsequent reading of critical texts across disciplines. And he goes on to explain how he uses his intrapersonal experience to explore the role of criticality within the field of AI while looking backward and forward in the field. Agri charts how his intrapersonal space, consciousness and purpose change, describing it as a slow, painful, institutionally located and historically specific process. I'm sure we all have sympathy with that. We've all been there, especially when we're marking. That each project has an associated has associated with it an evolving pedagogy situated within. I jumped. From Agri's thought, a number of threads emerge, and these are ones that I think YoHa shares really strongly. So, technologies are positioned as politically, culturally, socially, and economically effective. The intrapersonal space of people involved in a project is a legitimate site of inquiry, which I think is really important in the idea of a kind of technical practice, because that's normally completely discounted. And I find that, like, when people first learn programming, the question is to ask them, like, how does it change the structuring of their thinking? So that intrapersonal space where that happens, when we become acclimatized to the kind of technical objects that we're engaged with, like, how do we think about that? How can we express that? And how can we express it, you know, like from a kind of technical viewpoint? Yeah, that each project has associated with it an evolving pedagogy situated in an evolving environment. This is really kind of fundamental to how we think about critical technical practice. It's not like nothing is ever stable. So we're talking about a database, but every database, if we take one like MySQL, well, every instance of that enters into a different cultural and social context. So therefore, is it acting in the same way in those different contexts or not? Is it the same software even? Because it's got different dependencies that hold it up. If they're different language sets, different kinds of sociality surrounding it, is it still the same software or not? How do we think about or explore these problematics? Can't get used to printing on both sides of the bit of paper. Okay, so, and then I think what Elgri also gives us is a notion around kind of ethics, not the kind of ethics that protect your institution from liability, not those ones, the ones that we, you know, where you fill out your ethics form, but a different kind of ethics. And I think in this kind of ethics, the ethics become the context for what's made visible and what remains invisible to forms of power. So, for instance, within the addiction centre, people would sell us ways that they didn't fill in the forms. We never put it on the table. You know, so it's kind of, there's always questions of what you leave out, what remains invisible in a particular context, and that's a kind of ethical decision that you make. And then there's the kinds of ethical conflict that, as kind of, you know, artists, investigators, that we have within ourselves. Because, I mean, sometimes you see something and you think, like a really good video. Like where I live, there's an old man's hut and they have lots of boats where I have my boat. Make a stunning video, but it would push all the house prices up, so it's just a no-no. You know, you don't want to give away that kind of authenticity. Yeah, so this kind of ethical conflict, risk, personal or within a project, are important motors of engagement with technical objects, institutional, social or discursive critique. They help chart the historical conditions of the path of the project's taken. So constantly when you're doing a project like the database addiction or some of these things I'm going to talk to you about, you're constantly trying to work out the ethics all the time of what you should deal with, and sometimes you get it wrong and you get the sack. but never mind. So a related fork of critical technical practice that coincidentally aligns with many of these threads was initiated at the former Centre for Cultural Studies, which is now defunct for ethical reasons. And this stream of critical technical practice at Goldsmiths also incorporated art methods in a relatively loose alignment with threads pulled from Albury above. At its broadest, the kind of critical technical practice taught at Goldsmiths can be summarised as the formation of thought and action that incorporates art as a method of inquiry into a particular social technical milieu. And I just think most of you are not familiar with the PhD work of Tom Keane. Tom Keane has been looking for several years at the database of council house repairs in Lambeth, which, you know, I take my hat off to him. I mean, you know, and what he's done, because his house is going to be demolished in a regeneration programme, so he's spent the last kind of 3 or 4 years trying to understand that database, and then he can go to any flat and say, well, look, this is what the council's saying they spent on repairs. Did they actually spend it? And so what he's managing to do is he made a mirror of the database. He then used various of the language tools I was showing you to interrogate all the legal documents and formulate cases and go to court, but very much from within the technical side of the database. And so you could see Tom's work within a very, very particular social technical milieu, in that he's going to get thrown out of his house, so you better get on with it. So this is a kind of compacted intellectual form that makes the space between the technical, theory, practice and the interpersonal ambiguous. A typical project using critical technical practice would explore things and attempt to kind of explain the phenomena caught in the lens of the project or proposition and reflect on the process, which is how YoHa intends to pursue the project that we're going to look at. There's an example here which maybe is worth going through to kind of think about why it's difficult to think about these things. So we'll try that anyway. Sorry if it's boring. In the technical domain, if we're trying to think about these problems, it's what I was saying just now. If the exact same software for Facebook competitions or whatever runs on a series of machines, but has different software dependencies, operating systems and alike, is it the same software given that its functionality changes across platforms? You can answer now. It's a question.
Not the same.
Not the same. Okay.
What's the definition of software?
A piece of code, basically a piece of code running, I think.
Plus the user? Or just at the level of the code executing?
It's impossible, isn't it? You can't have one without the other, really. What do you think?
I guess taking the user out and landing more critical technical practice.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to consider what migrates across
But
platforms.
the user or the person involved in the code, you have the intrapersonal space. So it's definitely part of the critical technical practice to consider that. And I think it's kind of a really important that we do so. So I mean, how do we consider the form of such technical individuals which attempt to group certain logics within the symbolic space of an application, but also locate those individuals within an ensemble of myriad domains? And if we think about in the kind of social cultural domain, if that series of machines happens to run in different enterprises, cultures, societies, political and economic regimes, how can we think about the way software is affected in these different registers? So we've got the same piece of software, vaguely, or at least it's come out in a similar package. but it has all these different dependencies depending on which kind of machines it's running. And then we have it running within different kind of, sociality, within different cultural domains. And then in the interpersonal domain, how does the software affect memory, language, learning, and sociality? So we have these different domains. Then how can we begin to think about them? How can we begin to think about what this software thing might be in a kind of critical technical framework? What boundaries, frames of possibility, knowledge, power relations are created when software exists in the three overlapping domains? And the thing about the simple example that we were just looking at is that we would actually never ever make that distinction between them, because of course it's a live thing happening in all those domains at the same time. So in YoHa's technical practice, we would make no absolute distinction between the domains of the technical, social, political, cultural, or interpersonal, as a live machine under inquiry will be plugged into action, reaction, enablement, and disablement with all the domains simultaneously. The domains themselves are relatively arbitrary distinctions imposed or imagined to make things easier for ourselves to express, because we don't quite have the language with which to express this kind of complexity, or our relationships with this kind of complexity. Maybe someone in here does. No? Okay. So, probably not. I'll reboot the thing. So within a lot of the kind of personalisation literature that I read, I think this goes some way to kind of describe personalisation. So personalisation engines are enabler solutions for the personalisation process, which determines and deliver the experience of the user needs, often individually, changes. The online presentation layer delivers personalised messages, email, text, push notification, and provides analysis and reports to the business users. And this is a particular report by Gartner that I read, which looked at companies like Adobe and Microsoft and all these other companies in how they were using personalisation to enhance the user experience of their products. What kinds of experience do people have of personalisation?
When they write "Dear my name," when they write "Dear my name" and try to sound something.
Well, it's it's hang on, I want to show you something on the other operating system. Yeah, recommendations. Stupid recommendations for video, or Amazon recommendations. That's all questions of personalisation. Going to talk about your project. Oh, you can. Let's come up and show you. Well, I want to show you a die. Okay, so what a priori preconditions the logics that construct personalisation? How is industry using personalisation? What terrains will you encounter, stumble over, fall into to purchase a new battery for your phone from Amazon while attempting to resurrect a device that unfolds you into other registers of being sorted? What footprints do you leave in data clouds, clusters of silicon in the air-conditioned server farms? How do such traces form, reroute, trigger self-reflexive bubbles of social, economic and political possibility for the body to move through. It seems impossible to separate how personhood is formulated and meshed as it is within information structures. We can begin to see this as the technicality of our kind of contemporary culture. Let me look in here. Here you go. So one way that personalisation happens on a really trivial scale is the way that Google will suggest what it is you're searching for. And so you can kind of play a game with yourself with Google in order to kind of like see what it's going to recommend. And this is kind of like 40 of the most stupid ones. In the project we was working on, we was asked to kind of think about some way to get people to think about personalisation, and I really liked the idea of people sending in their most stupid Google suggestion and then trying to work out how this was, how Google might be suggesting this. You want to look at some more? There's rude ones. That's a good one. There you go. Okay. Rid of that bit. Okay. So during the latter stage, during the kind of early stages of this research, I decided to use a software suite called Datasploit. Has anyone used Datasploit? Okay, so I can show you some aspects of it when we go into the Kali Linux. And it's part of this grouping of a series of software called open source intelligence. Are people familiar with open source intelligence? No? So if you imagine like this, how much money is being spent for people to actually produce, the Secret Service to produce data on people. But if you think that actually there's much more data already out there, and if you could convince those corporations to share it with you, actually you don't need the intelligence services at all. So if you get all the data to be open, then you can have open source intelligence. And open source intelligence already, we'll have a little look on here, is quite... It's a great video if I can show it to you. Yeah, be a spy at home.
So first of all, this is going to be a typical video, but I find this topic very interesting, so I thought I would share it.
Okay, I'll turn the volume off and I'll guide you through it.
He describes it as collecting data from...
So basically, open source intelligence is the method to collect data from any public source. So, you know, like birth records, blogs, any bits of your Facebook, anything you like. And open source intelligence is used a lot now by companies when you go for a job interview. Most companies now will use OSINT in order to profile you for when you're going for the job. Because what you can do is you can do a complete profile on someone in about 10 minutes. And in the research project we was doing, I profiled some people I was doing the research with, and within like a couple of minutes, I had their Amazon wish lists. I had emails that they sent to a pharmacist. Just that, I didn't do anything dark at all. Just completely, just use completely public information, and it reveals it. We found that Goldsmiths had been hacked 3 times, which none of the staff members knew, just by using kind of OSINTs. And what he's talking here is he's saying that that he couldn't find where that rocket went off. And you know, he's been using Google Earth, and you can use that as a kind of, you know, open source intelligence. And so he couldn't find it. So then what he starts doing is he looks for when it's next to the sea, and he eventually finds it just by kind of viewing things on there. So he actually found this base that wasn't on any other maps just by using a number of different sources. And in this version, what he's doing is he's using it, you know, kind of like he's making a, I don't know, some kind of weird military spy situation. And here he's talking about in Ukraine, where people decided that, like they said, the rebels said that they didn't knock down the plane. And then what he does is he goes through this video showing how people in Ukraine were able to say, well, no, that's not true. And then they tracked the actual truck that was taking the missile that shot the plane down. So he talks about that really quite well. Okay. Okay, how many of you have heard of Robert David Steele? Anyone heard of him? It's probably a good thing. He used to work for the Secret Service in the States, and he's a complete exponent of this, which is the Open Source Everything Manifesto, which tends to combine kind of libertarian politics, left politics, and alt-right politics at exactly the same time. So it's kind of like does wonders with your head. And in it, what he's trying to do is trying to dismantle the deep state by having open source intelligence. But he's also trying to have open source everything, which means that every engine, every piece of technology is open to reduce the cost. And therefore the poor will be able to use these open everything. Okay, so he's completely gone. And then you're just getting into it and you're looking at these videos and you think, this is not bad. And then you find the one where he talks about the people on Mars. And you think, well, you know, not quite sure here. Anyway, it's kind of like, but he goes around advising. In this video is where he's advising Scandinavian countries on building the first kind of open source everything intelligence service for the whole of Scandinavia, which is kind of, yeah, that's his gig. So he's well worth kind of looking at, but don't be surprised if you feel sick after you've read some of it. So I think that, like, when we was trying to think about kind of how personalization could be a kind of proposition for inquiry, and what we kind of got to in a kind of phrase that we was trying to think about was the individuation of the personal that takes place within computation is not a portrait of the living body. It's the sorted metadata of the body moving through the flows of advanced capitalism. Representation of the act rather than the act itself. The flows of corporal bodies are, however, contingent on such networks as a reticulate process of expectation and desire filtered in a machinic process. So it's kind of like, you know, how do we figure what's going on here? I mean, what is it what is the personalization that takes place when you're online? What is that being that's created all those traces of you? How does it affect you that an employer or someone who hates you can profile you so quickly? What is it, what is its relationship to your kind of corporal body or your sociality? So it's not a question of like, I thought it was really interesting when the whole Cambridge Analytica thing came out, because of course I should think most people in this room knew that was already going on. What surprised me with open source intelligence was that it was far larger and easier than I ever thought. We'll have a look at a piece of software from Cali. So it's not. I haven't spelled it right. Well, is it Montalgo? On the end notes.
Passed it. Was it not out?
Did you see it?
Yeah, not out. More. Still more.
There we are. Montego. Okay. Oh, this is not one I've watched, but anyway. There he goes. Okay, so what you're going to see is in this piece of software, which is kind of a nice piece of open source software, you can start off with, say, something like someone's phone number. You start with the phone number, and then what it'll do is it'll actually find out what that phone number is associated with, or which people it's associated with. And if we look down here, or if it's kind of an email address or something like that, it'll begin to kind of plot out those relationships, which it's doing there. And then you can go into any of those relationships and get those to plot out at the same time. And you can kind of build a pretty decent map of someone within a very short period of time. It's only one particular method. And what you would tend to do is tend to use kind of like more kind of content analysis like that. But what you also do is all of this will be, so there'll be bits of content, but then you can also look for IP addresses. So then what you do is take the IP address of that person, which you can find pretty easily, and then you can start mapping out kind of networks from the IP address, and then you cross-link the IP address to kind of email addresses, and you build a very good profile very, very quickly. And this is completely standard practice. So if people think, oh well, I'm not using Facebook, all the other traces that you have, any traces that you have, are very, very easy to profile. And so something like Datasploit will do all of this, and then it will do all of the IP addresses and everything else at the same time. But it also searches the dark web to see whether you've got anything down there, find out like who's selling your emails, or your email accounts or passwords, whether you've been compromised or whatever at the same time. And with the people I was working with, I profiled them and then I presented them with a profile, but they weren't very pleased that I profiled them. But Matthew Fuller was very pleased. He was really happy. But okay. Yeah. Oh yeah. Of course.
How were you surprised by what?
I was surprised at like how far I could get, but I was also really pleased because I've used non-proprietary systems for a very long time, and they seem to be pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So I was happy with that.
Does it work across languages at all? Like if you profile me, would it track people in another country and
Yeah, I don't think it would have it because it's only kind of matching regular expressions. It wouldn't care what language they're in.
I hope I can relate to this.
So let's look at a couple of the things in Cali because I think that's kind of like quite an interesting way to go. So with this this notion of kind of personalisation, just why this is booty. We kind of came up with a number of approaches that we thought might be interesting for exploring personalisation. And we had a number of ideas. One was that we would make people's portraits from their browser history. So we get people to donate their browser history to us from the last year, and then we would kind of build a profile of them from that. Not sure that was very exciting after Cambridge Analytica. I don't think we'd get many takers. We did a really interesting thing, like which we should talk about with your project a little bit, shouldn't we? About you were using wish lists on Amazon, weren't you?
Yeah, I was using that because that was the only way I could influence the recommendation system without actually buying things when I was in there.
Yeah. Okay, so Simon was doing a project where he was doing looking at Amazon's recommendation system. And he was doing this as part of his MA. And he wrote a software library called Snoo Snoo. And what he did was you used, was it 6 different profiles, books?
Yeah, I mean I did tons of
Tell
them.
people what.
Well, I wrote something using Selenium browser automation, which is basically it's quite, you can scrape just about anything with it. You have to write a lot of code, and you're basically just crudely controlling a browser and then making it do things. So I wrote something that logged into Amazon, searched for products, added them to wish lists, scraped recommendations, and I did profiles. I think I put
You did Hitler.
yeah, I put Mein Kampf through natural language processing. Found some of the most frequently occurring tokens in that. Searched Amazon with that, and the bizarre thing was that the recommendations I got were for children's toys. It was just yeah, it was very strange, and I didn't know how I could possibly profile someone like. Is there
I
some?
don't know if it's that strange actually, though, because it's the one thing that you learn about Hitler that is not about that is that he loved children and he loved dogs. So there's a really strange connection there. So it's almost like propaganda coming back, because that would be the argument against the kind of like, oh, he's a monster.
What I learned from Simon's project is always make sure as an academic your wish list is private. Otherwise your students will come up to you and say, that was a nice bit of romantic fiction you were just reading. Or they'll actually present you with some horrible book that you've got on, you know, blood-curdling embarrassment of what you've got on your wish list. I'll probably just get some kind of wicker baskets or something. So Simon kind of like undertook this project, and it was really useful for me to understand Simon's project and how it might work within kind of personalisation. But we came up with a few different notions that we could possibly use, and a few places in which it's occurring. So we thought about looking at kind of personalisation and medical prescriptions, how you could compare what kind of medicines you took, and that could automatically compare someone else's medicines, and then how, by the comparison of medications that you're taking, you could actually look at the side effects and things like this, which was a kind of, coming from Matsuko's illness, seemed a kind of quite an interesting way to explore it. We also had the idea of weird recommendations. So like what you do is you kind of collect up all the weird recommendations. I don't know whether you've had it on YouTube when you get kind of recommended kind of, I don't know, some kind of like semi-pornographic thing when you're watching kind of like loan on a yacht or something. So look at those kinds of recommendations as well and get people to try and think those through as a possible project. Anyone got any suggestions to explore personalisation?
Can there be personalization that's again in first where you are looking at all the people around you, but not actually using any of your data? Doesn't have to be your data.
Well, yeah.
Possible profiles.
We was trying to think about like how could you what games could you play in order to understand how the process works. I mean, there's the idea of point-to-point Amazon, where you start with one product and you have to get to another one through the ones that you kind of search. So I think it is about like, what kind of pedagogy can we have that will illuminate the process for us. So it's better if it's your data, isn't it?
Can I say something?
Yeah, go.
So one of the common recommendations system algorithms I use is called collaborative filtering. It does just that. You end up with a matrix of products and users, and they do some vector maths that I don't quite understand, and based on other people's activity, they recommend you things. So, I mean, they are doing this on like a planetary scale, this kind of number creation, and it's not just you. It's bizarre. It's weird machine unconscious.
It was really interesting the other day in the boat club. I mean, it's full of old men, and we just had to put up some surveillance because someone's been nicking stuff. And I had to get this bloke on Facebook, and he's sitting there and so he gets his Google account. He gets on Facebook, and he said, "Where did all these people come from?" Because all the suggestions of his friends, like he'd never had a Google account, he'd never been on Facebook, and it got at least 20 people, you know what I mean, like just from him kind of joining. And he was like completely freaked out by the idea, by how this magical process suddenly, like all of his family, close friends were immediately there. It was really interesting to watch. Should have videoed it.
Yeah, wait, so so he just signed up on Facebook and used it. So where did it?
Because he's probably because he used his own name, so his name would have been mentioned in posts.
Oh, yeah.
And so basically it did his name, and then it would have like found that his kids were on there, and then it would have used his kids, and so very effective. Because I mean, as soon as he said, I told him to lie. At least I got him to lie about his birth date, but he didn't lie about his gender or about where he lives. So it would have gone, Leon C. These two, Leon C. Same surname, bang. Got you.
What's interesting, also in relation to what you said, and what I'm interested in this topic very much, is that personalization is not personal.
No.
What I mean? It's like it is
actually
not
yes.
about who you are or making things tailored to you.
Sorry,
it is some kind of process through which you are calculated, but not even you, but some things calculated out of all these other things that don't even need to come from you.
But the problem is that then it constructs, because it formulates the bubbles in which you exist within your social networks and within all these other networks. So that's why in the statement I was trying to say earlier, it is, of course it is not you. It's not a portrait. But then at the same time, it inhabits your lived experience, and also it's like so clearly kind of immersed within advanced capitalism, the flows of it, and it's like so I think it is a new kind of again it's kind of related back to the complexity with which we think about these things. It's very difficult.
I was thinking about the same as well, and how much is inferred from offline. I mean, the way that it feels to you like you have a conversation with someone just like this, and then you log on to somewhere and something from your conversation comes up, and you think, well, is my phone listening, or something like that. But how it just infers from your geographical position, the location. Oh, it's a company. You probably were talking to a colleague. These sets of concepts were probably, connected to that kind of business or that kind of institution, and all these patterns. So it feels personal, even private to you, but then it's actually just stereotype or prototype almost of it.
I mean, there are other things going on, that there's agents that act as you within networks when you're not there. So that's another element of what's taking place as well. So it's not just the information they got, they're also, an agent will be trying to perform to look like you for stress testing systems and things.
So more about this? Agents that act as you when you're not there?
Yeah, so for instance, like in the electricity grid, when you're not using your electricity, there's an agent that acts like you're using your electricity. And so if they want to stress test, they tell those agents to kind of be extreme, all put the kettle on at the same time, like at Wimbledon, the tennis, in order to test the system. It's the same with your phone. Your phone will have an agent that acts like you when you're not there, because otherwise you can't, because you're constantly stress testing the system. And so the agents learn from your behaviours, and then they act something like it. It wouldn't be you or exactly you, but the agents will be acting within the network based on as a proxy for you when you're not there.
The thing about the wish list and the sort of the consumption aspect or experience of personalisation, I kind of feel like even before Cambridge Analytica broke, that news broke, that people very readily fell into the camp of well, I know this is going on, but if it's just being used to sell me more shit that I don't need, I'm okay with it. So I wonder, is there a way of flipping how personalisation feels, because I felt something that came out of CA is kind of the pen testing relationship to how you can be identified in a network, that you could be the weak link in the chain that then compromises the network of people that you feel affinity with. But I don't know how that would come true. And I was wondering with this personalization, is it figuring people as nodes in a network, or is it figuring them as, say, members of a cohort or part of a set? What's the kind of dominant way that
I think that's the kind of politics of it. It's the way, Cambridge Analytica was definitely looking at people as a set, wasn't it? That's what it wanted, and then target them with a particular advertisement. So I think in that, it's a very particular... Say it again to me.
I guess in pen testing, it's if you think of it as a network, the weakest link in the network is what brings it down. But if they're targeting us as a data set or as a set of elements or as a statistical cohort, what's the vulnerability there? And how to make that vulnerability maybe related to emerging forms of convenience, like Google's plan to integrate a lot of biometric variables so that you don't have to do anything to unlock your phone, that it recognises you, and to how to make people feel more uncomfortable about that before it becomes normalised, even though I feel like it's getting normalised because there's ads for banks saying, isn't it a pain in the ass to remember your password, now we'll do voice recognition, and you're sorted. So is that already getting normalised to the point where people will say, treat that in the same way as if it's just going to sell me more stuff, that's okay?
Yeah, I think the thing is that because the personalisation stuff happens at the moment, you're going to get your new job and you're already profiled. And then within the job itself, you're being constantly monitored to see, how well you're doing against, other vectors of how people have done before you or whatever. So I think it's very difficult within that. I'm not sure there's any break on it. I think it's going to be, hopefully, because I think we're also talking here, about kind of, machine intelligence as well, and how that's developing. and personalisation, you know, and all of these things. And I don't really have a clue how to begin to think them through, because I think that there's such a substantial change between the relational machine and the database, and then what happens when you've got kind of machine intelligence added onto that. I think, you know, you could safely interpret the database within kind of, you know, Foucaultian, Simondon type notions. But as soon as we get to kind of probability machines, where there is no truth, there's no apparent truth anyway, it's just a probability of what might be, and then that makes the world. I'm not sure how we deal with that.
I think the UK is maybe an interesting site given how much gambling is part of the lived space. And I thought casino for a while, I understand that this is a quotidian element of the UK experience, that entire franchise atmospheres exist in which people are comfortable entering into and are maybe a little bit aware that they're being exploited, but they're still okay with that, and it's quite multi-sensory. So I don't know if that's an interesting ambience or atmosphere. If, like with the machine intelligence, that probabilistics and risk are now being added on to what the relational machine enables you to query about a cohort.
But I think we've got to kind of like, there's got to be the questions of power within this. What kinds of flows of power are emerging from it, and why? I mean, I understand, like with Cambridge Analytica, I very much, for me anyway, I very much doubt it worked. But that's not the point. As long as politicians believed it worked, then they'd have got funded, and for all intents and purposes it worked. But I mean, I don't actually imagine that the algorithm would work that well. And so again, it's like, you know, how are these things? It's the representation rather than the act itself again within kind of advanced capitalism.
But I think it's you know, what's interesting is the way in which the kind of logic extends beyond the market, for example, which I think is a lot more easier for people to just kind of be okay with.
Yeah.
Even getting recommendations to something like preemptive strikes, which is like the same logic is then used.
Say that again.
With like preemptive strikes.
Yeah.
And it's the exact same logic in a way, you know, it's like that future, or like that non-existent being that somehow is first represented and then acts, or is acted upon rather. And I think that that's what, for me at least, is really interesting, the kind of like, you know, the same logic runs through those things, but because it's so normal or not as threatening within one field, somehow it's already normalized within another, where it's much more serious and much more dangerous, I think.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I made my students do an exercise where I took like effects of automated warfare from drone theory and said, look, like the way people are calculated to become targets is the same way you're calculated to become customers. And the exercise was that they would come up with the similar notions, but for the Western world, they refused to do it. They were so like, kind of, they thought they were uncomfortable. 1 year they loved it, like the 1 year cohort, and the next year they refused to do it. But yeah, it is the same logic.
Okay, so
optimism. Last thing I think may be interesting with the GDPR that's come in is that there's a legal provision within that data holders who hold data to profile you or make decisions, and they don't know how this is going to be implemented, but they will have to make it transparent how they have arrived at a decision for profiling you.
But that was in the old law, that if a machine made a decision about you, of which you didn't decide that it had the permission to make it, then it couldn't make that decision about you. But then when you ask questions about proxies, you know, but as soon as you were pseudo-anonymised, then it could make decisions about you. So your medical records would make decisions for you about funding in particular areas of cancer or whatever, but because it was pseudo-anonymised, you no longer had that data. So the metadata was, you know, could be used to make decisions, and it'd probably be true in that as well. Let's have a little look at what's going on here. Oh, okay. So.
probably splitting the display.
Well, I think so, yeah. Are we done? Okay. Well, that's all right. We can finish.
I'm very interested in it.
I can do it for the people that are left. Stephen, do you know where the monitor stuff is in Kali Linux?
I don't use it, I'm using it.
I'll turn it round this way and just tell people. That's probably the best way to do it. So, within Kali Linux, there's a number of kind of categories. So you have like information gathering, where you would use things like Nmap. People know what Nmap is. So Nmap enables you to kind of like, what you do is you can find out, if I go to Olga's machine, I can find out which ports are open, which I can kind of interrogate. So it's great fun to sit on a train and then Nmap any phones that connect to your machine. It's great excitement on the anyway, so you also have ones like ZenMap, which will so if I can get into your house and I find one IP address, I can then find out all the other ones and I can do a topology of that, and then I can interrogate those machines as well. So if we look down here, we've then got like kind of vulnerability analysis. And there's various methods here with which you can actually, what you do is you check for the vulnerability in a system. So if I can find like an open port, say an FTP port, then what I can do is hang on the back of that port and I can look for any clear passwords, and then I've got a way in. There's web application analysis, which kind of allows you to look through the way that people are viewing online. So there's a whole lovely section here on how people are actually doing that. Then you have like database analysis. So you have a whole suite to invade people's databases and collect up passwords. People know how that works. So if a very simple way. So if I want to break into a wireless network, I would come down here and I would probably use something like, here we are, wireless attack. Let's have a look, which one should we use? We could use Kismet, maybe this one, we'll use this one. It should come up. And what we would do is we would first scan the network, and what we do is we listen, and this machine will say to Olga's machine, you've disconnected. And Olga's machine will go, I need to reconnect. And then what this machine will do is take the header, and so I'll now have your secret key to the network. And then what it'll do is it'll go through a dictionary of all known passwords that it's got, which is quite large. And it will re-encrypt every single word in that dictionary until it finds out the one that you use on to encrypt the key here. And it's a kind of standard procedure for like how to break in. And it works like a lot of times. If that doesn't work, then you have to use brute force. So then what you'll be doing is you'll start off like with particular character strings, and then you have to just brute force it, but that takes days and days, rather than being able to do it quite quickly with a system like this. And once you've found a nice vulnerability in a university, like a printer or something, which is a dumb terminal, then you can inhabit that dumb terminal, and you can do what you like. It's freedom time. Okay, so that would be kind of wireless attacks. So you know you have those problems at home, like where you want to download that movie, but you're a bit worried about doing it on your own Wi-Fi. Just break into all your neighbours. It's fine. And you can combine the speeds. You don't have to get the same section from each one. You know, it's very good.
It's just a normal distribution of Linux.
Yeah.
That just includes all
It's an aggressive system for stress testing. So it's completely legal. Not doing what I just said isn't completely legal, but it's not legal at all. But anyway, and then there's lots of kind of reverse engineering where you kind of listen to a device in order to find out like kind of how it's been built, or find any ways to exploit it. There's a bunch of exploitation tools. Metasploit, which is the one that I was talking about earlier, which will bring together a whole bunch of. I should show you how this looks. So if I use something like this, so it looks like a normal application, but actually it's like a command line piece of code, and then it tells you how to use it, and then away you go with that piece of code for whatever you're doing. So it appears a bit like a normal operating system, but actually it's just lots of bits of code carefully kind of grouped together, and also it has all the latest kind of breaks that they've managed to formulate. So there's quite a lot of kind of forensic stuff where you can read kind of the traces of files on a hard disk that's been deleted. Then you have reporting tools. I'm not quite sure what they are. Social engineering tools. That's like where so there's kind of a whole, so there's six or seven there where you're profiling people. And you have like this is like system services. So there you go. So Kali Linux, I recommend that you kind of download it, stick it on so basically you don't put it on your machine, you download it and put it on a USB key, and then you can actually encrypt it, and then as soon as someone comes in the room, whip it out.
Are you looking into this in relation to personalization?
That's what I was looking at. I was looking, because a lot of these tools here are used, they're the same tools that when you go to that interview, someone's profile will be used.
Then it is actually very personal, because there is your data. So it's kind of different personalization, but this abstract personalization. It's kind of...
But what's useful about this is, say something like the Metasploit, is that, because Metasploit will bring together lots of people's code that's looking at that, how those profiles are constructed. And so by looking at the code and by using it, you find out, okay, so they're using this kind of search, and then they're using this one, they're using that one. That's what's really useful about it.
Is the whole OS like basically a way in which our vulnerability to being enmeshed with these systems has just been made convenient? So like that exists and can be used on a person by person basis is an exemplification of how vulnerable we are individually, but we don't think about how that makes us vulnerable collectively.
I think so. I don't know why. I was really surprised when I looked at this, like how advanced it all was and how convenient, and how I didn't need to do anything grey in order to use it. I could be absolutely legal, and what it revealed to me was how vulnerable we are. You know what I mean, to these systems, the complete vulnerability, and that's weird that we've actually thought about our security. You know what I mean? That's like, doing it on myself, how vulnerable I was.
Maybe some register like Punch Drunk or that sort of performative theatre where people go on expecting experience, but just submit one attribute to that, and then that becomes the narrative that whoever puts on that performance does, like a way of holding up to people. Like maybe some of the registers like live action role playing are a way that people could experience this and then take it back with with them out into the world.
Well, sorry. Go on.
So that would be like the premise of the LARP, is that you go prepared to like build a narrative from something found and then playing out a theft or something, or okay, that's a great idea.
But I think there's like, for me, the people I was working with, I profiled them with this stuff, and in a kind of naive artist way, I thought that would be a good idea. I thought what I'll do is I'll kind of profile people, present it to them, they'll be surprised, and then they'll be able to feel it and articulate, you know what I mean, kind of what they feel and what they think about having had that done. But in fact, they just thought I was completely unethical, and I don't work with them anymore. But so I was really surprised, you know what I mean, that a kind of art method here would be to do that exactly. You know, I do it to anyone, and you know, surprise them, show them, you know, and then they thank you for it, and also that, you know, they hate you for it, but kind of like, but you revealed something. But that's really not acceptable, it seems, you know, in many kinds of fields.
That's why I thought maybe LARP is interesting, because from what I understand, they are very good at explicating consent mechanisms, so understanding what we consent to in that space is a big part of undertaking it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was kind of quite keen to get people's kind of, you know, browser history for a year. You know, whether people would give it to you, you know what I mean, like what it would reveal, what that would, you know, how they would relate to it.
But that also still feels very like disembodied. So I think like I don't know, like I'm trying to understand, like, if you did something like that, but then it's like created into like a little like dirty avatar or something like that, I don't know, or is like the other voice like the evil them, or the, I don't know, this sort of like all the, and if someone like eats a bunch of junk food and they show you like Inside Out or how like on cigarette packets and they're like murdering, you know, whatever. But if it was like an ongoing kind of like bot of you, like from everything that you're like shitting that's being able to be collected, like I don't know, I think it's kind of nice, and it's not just like here's a profile, but like somehow if you bring it into like an embodied field, maybe that would be.
I think search history is extremely private. I would never give my search history to even you. I mean, I think everyone's aware that it's like it knows everything about you. And there is this I Love Alaska. Have you watched it? There's a film made when IAOL search history logs were leaked, and then some journalists created this 12 mini episodes series on which tells the history of search. Like it's just one woman, and this voice is reading out her searches over 12 episodes of 7 minutes, and the whole her life history emerges, and they were like showing how it's not, it was all anonymized, but then it was really easy then to track her, identify her, and the whole her life was there. Yeah. So I think everyone's really aware of whole piece.
I don't know, the problem is that like we kind of find ways, you know, to sort of forget about the scale of things, and it's like there's so many cities and like things like that people describe as sci-fi instead of dystopian, which I find really interesting. It's not like the colony, for example, where you have like this massive database, and like in order to track down people and like criminals and things like that, you just like print out their entire history, like everything, every file they've ever, you know, uploaded, like all of their addresses, because obviously anytime we pay for anything we have to say where we live, and like all of these things, so they just like print them out and they're like, okay, this is who this person is, and they just go for it. But that's not, you know, it's not sci-fi, it's just, it's what's happening right now.
But it's the difference of like, you have the search history, but it's kind of like how people are sane or not sane. It's like not like people never, I was listening to something a long time ago, and it was this guy who like all of a sudden had like he was watching a horror movie, totally normal kind of a guy with his fiance, and then in the middle of the movie, he like had this incredible, very realistic flash of like murdering, of like killing the person he loved, and it was like reflecting the kind of like knifing or whatever that they were watching on the TV, and then he like went on a total spiral and like couldn't get he couldn't stop these visions. So it was terrifying to him because it felt so real that he thought that he was doing it or was going to do it. It was so severe. But and then he was talking about how eventually like the therapy had to do and stuff, and the person was like, well, it's not that no one else doesn't have these thoughts. All of this shit is there, but then they just don't act on it, and then the choice of action is the thing that makes the reality. Like it's not, and you don't feel secure in the fact that your mind isn't like sort of doing this easy filtering for you. And so it's kind of interesting, I think, like cool with the idea of something becoming more accessible and embodied. Is it's like not from this streamline of terrifying thoughts. Like of course, if anyone could like read everything that I thought, it'd be like all sorts of shit could be made out of that. But then to like make you feel like you've actually made that decision or lived that route that might come up from like one line of your search history is a different.
But if you search how to murder someone, for example, it's like that personal, thought that maybe you would like have, becomes public and can be found. And I think that it's like the panopticon effect. It's like if I present you with all your searches, you know which one you don't want me to know about. I don't even have to read it. And like that's the thing that I find so scary, that it is. I'm like, it's not embodied and it's not material, but it's so, like some of your searches will be, like at the kind of like the depth of.
Do you think that you can think about it as like the life of the mind, and then there's an action, and what would be the equivalent in like databases or in the machine, because all these probabilistic scenarios are kind of like the life of the mind.
Right.
In a way, like because there's a calculation of all possibilities. Is there like an equivalent of what you think about in relation to human as an action, that you decide to act on something or not? What would that be there? Is it power? Does it come from power? Does it come? Who decides that that is the cut, or how is the cut made then? Because we know how it's made in the human, or at least we hope, or whatever we kind of theorize about it. But if you kind of move that structure onto the technical structure.
Surely it would be what's output. I mean, that's the obvious answer. What it actually ends up being output.
Maybe there's a way that we, to approach this, which is instead of like how it kind of acts on us, but is to kind of like, wouldn't it, I think it would be really good if I could have a profile that meant I was at work but I'm not there. or like, have a certain fantasy of myself that I can kind of, propagate across networks and, find ways that, generally make the whole shit up,
Yeah, but that's the difference. So if like someone's killed someone or not, that's an output that's different, and an output from that system might be false. Like it can calculate that you're likely to buy goji berries, but you're not bothered. And so it's
still rather. I mean, you could still. I don't know. I mean, some. You see people hitting on about 20 people a month. I mean, yeah, it's a failure, but it's an output. I don't know. I mean, humans are not.
But it's interesting because maybe of the output.
We should probably finish.
Any more questions? Thank you very much.
Okay.